Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. At least 5 Birmingham mosques were attacked overnight. In the wake of the New Zealand anti-Muslim terror attacks, the United Kingdom has been the scene of several Islamophobic incidents. At the same time, New Zealand has come together for Friday prayers today, and a gun ban is soon to be enforced. An Auckland private girls' school first confirmed, then lifted a ban on the hijab. Put together, this makes for a concerning picture for Muslims across the West with a growing right-wing anti-Islam movement. To discuss all of that further, we're first joined by Mr. Andrew Turner, who is the Deputy Mayor of Christchurch. Christchurch, of course, the location of those terror attacks there in New Zealand. Andrew, we appreciate you taking our time out to join us here in Scope this evening. What do you make, Andrew, of today's Friday prayers there in New Zealand and the gun ban?
Yeah, indeed. I mean, I was there at the Friday prayers in Christchurch today, and that was a very special moment for Christchurch and for New Zealand. We've been through a week here of shock and of mourning because of what happened last Friday, and many of us never expected an atrocity like this to happen in New Zealand, and certainly not to happen here in Christchurch. And what happened today at Friday prayers was quite amazing. The Muslim community came together. There were a number of people there who had been injured in the attacks last Friday who were there at Friday prayers today. But about 20,000 members of the wider community came to be there. So these are non-Muslim members of the wider community came to be there to support our Muslim community, to stand side by side with our Muslim brothers and sisters in that Friday prayer event today. And what we really saw was an act of total solidarity, total support for our Muslim community here in Christchurch. Okay. A part of what happened today was a 2-minute silence that was observed by the whole country. Yes. And that I know was observed in a number of international locations outside of New Zealand, as we did that as well. So yes. Quite a special moment for Christchurch, quite a special moment for New Zealand, and a true show of support for our Muslim brothers and sisters in their time of need.
You know, Andrew, we know, obviously, as you well know as well, the Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern has spoken about that ban on semi-automatic weapons and other such specific guns. What do you make of that measure, and what more needs to be done beyond just, talking about gun laws? What of then specifically going after hate speech / hate crimes?
Indeed. I mean, the discussions in Christchurch this week obviously have been around those gun law reforms which have been clearly signalled by Parliament. And I think the events of last Friday make it almost inevitable that there will be changes to New Zealand gun laws, very similar to situations that happened in Australia some time ago after a shooting incident there. I think, there's a high level of support for those changes now, and, Parliament will go through the processes they need to go through, but I think it's clear that there will be change there. In terms of other conversations that have been had in Christchurch and in New Zealand this week, there's a real need for education around different cultures and different religions. There's certainly, as a result of what happened here last Friday, a real willingness for people to learn and for people to be more aware of different cultures and different religions within what really is a very multicultural society here in New Zealand. I talked earlier about 20,000 non-Muslims who attended the Friday prayers today. And for many of those people, that would be the closest contact they've had with the Muslim religion throughout their lives. So what we've really got here is an opportunity for people to learn more about different cultures, to learn more about different religions, and through that understanding will become a greater level of awareness, a greater level of acceptance that we are one community, and within that community there are different religions and different ways of doing things. But,
okay, so
yeah,
Andrew, I'm just going to come in. I do apologize. I wanted to ask you, Andrew, and I'm sure you do. I'm sure you appreciate the global reach of this sort of hatred, right? Islamophobia.
Yeah.
And we can obviously talk about what happened in Birmingham, which I'm sure you are well aware of. Overnight, there were about
Indeed,
5 mosques
yeah.
that were attacked with sledgehammers. I wonder then what kind of conversations you think should be occurring between, for example, the New Zealand and British governments and otherwise. How does then one officially or unofficially, react to this growing wave? And, it does seem to be overwhelming now because, right after what had happened in New Zealand, in fact, the day after, I believe it was the morning after in the UK, there was even a hammer attack on some worshippers outside a mosque in London as well. So it seems a tad bit overwhelming, and the response at times, and I'm not saying that's your response or any specific person's response, sometimes seems a bit muted. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I mean, it's unfortunate that we see more of these kind of attacks. And I mean, this is terrorism, essentially. This is acts that make the Muslim communities feel less safe. And it's a total lack of respect for multiculturalism in our societies. And I mean, there are some questions clearly that are going to need to be asked in New Zealand as a result of what happened last Friday. Clearly, there is an anti-Islamic element, which is very much there. Whilst our wider community has come together in support this week, I don't doubt that there are still elements of Islamophobia in New Zealand, and we're seeing a manifestation of that, obviously, in England in those incidents that you were just talking about there.
Yeah.
But, education, cultural competency, really just bringing communities together is the way that we can overcome this. But a complete intolerance for racism, even at the most basic level, for anti-Muslim comments, for racist comments at the most basic level, as communities, we must become completely intolerant of that, so that when we hear those kind of comments in their most basic forms, we as a community take responsibility for saying, that's not acceptable, you can't talk that way. And it's from those relatively innocent comments in the beginning, they then develop into, more accepted forms of hatred and culminate, unfortunately, in the kind of incidents that we're talking about on this program today.
And I think Andrew, if I may, because I think
prevent that sort of conversation.
An important example, if I may, Andrew, to bring up is that what happened with the private girls' school there in Auckland, and I know you must be aware of that hijab issue that came up, because again, it seemed ill-timed, and it just seemed like it was an odd move and statement to make at the time it was made specifically as well. And overall, even then, why put in a hijab ban in a private school? As in, what exactly is that message? Would they also ban then the Jewish skull cap or the Sikh turbans or, otherwise? Do you think that, and what do you think, in fact, of that case, and what work needs to be done in that regard as well? Because, you spoke about education, and then that is at a school itself, and that's really worrying then, isn't it?
Of course, yeah. I mean, our young people are our future, and the way that we treat our young people, assists in forming their views, either positive or negative. And I heard about this earlier today, and I was quite shocked when I heard that in the current climate that hijab ban was being enforced. I'm particularly pleased to see that a different view has been taken, but really as a result of public pressure. I think it's important that, particularly in our educational establishments and the messages that we're sending to our young people, that those messages are about inclusion and about respect for different religions and different cultures. Yeah. And the hijab ban is exactly the opposite to what I would expect to see. And again, if the current situation in New Zealand as a result of what happened last Friday and greater acceptance of New Zealand as a multicultural society is one of the things that's led to the lifting of that hijab ban, then that becomes another example of where what we've been dealing with in the last week has resulted in a positive, inclusive outcome, rather than something that shows intolerance for different ways of doing things.
Andrew, I'm just going to take a few more minutes of your time as a final question that I want to put to you. I wanted to, Andrew, because in many places around the world, when these sorts of attacks occur, and I'm not saying that New Zealand would necessarily be the same, but these sorts of things are then forgotten quite quickly. For now, of course, we've seen that the Prime Minister of New Zealand and officials such as yourself and otherwise still sticking with this story very much. Is there, and can you give a guarantee that New Zealand will deal with these issues that this has brought up properly so that such incidents do not occur against any minority that lives in New Zealand?
I think New Zealand leaders have risen up this week and have really taken a very strong leadership position on this, that we will not see this happen again in New Zealand. Our community has definitely taken a position that we will work to ensure that nothing like this happens again in New Zealand. And I think the way that our Prime Minister has led this has shown the rest of the world that we will lead the way in changing the way that these kind of attacks are dealt with. And if we can deal with this in New Zealand in a positive way and bring communities together, I would like to think that shows a leadership of the way that could happen elsewhere in the world. So, we're very aware that all eyes have been on Christchurch in these last few days. Indeed. We want a positive legacy to come out of that. And that really is about acceptance of different cultures and an end to some of these terrible atrocities that we've been seeing, not least here in Christchurch.
Okay, Andrew. And of course, as you can imagine, we will in the media you to account and the New Zealand government to account, of course, in the coming days, months, even years about how all this plays out going forward with, of course, the best of hope. That was Andrew Turner, Deputy Mayor of Christchurch, who was speaking to us there from Christchurch in New Zealand. Andrew, of course, we appreciate your time this late, of course, there in Christchurch in New Zealand. Viewers, do stay with us, though. We will continue this conversation after this short break. Viewers, thank you for staying with us here in Scope as we're continuing to discuss Islamophobia in the context of what's occurred, of course, in New Zealand, in Christchurch, and then of the other incidents that occurred, specifically the one last night, the 5 Birmingham mosques that were also attacked with a sledgehammer with their windows shattered. To just continue this conversation, we're now joined by Anjum Rahman, who is a social activist. She's also the media spokesperson for the Islamic Women's Council of New Zealand, and she's joining us now via Skype from Hamilton in New Zealand. Anjum, thanks for taking your time out to join us here in Scope. I know it's been an eventful day there in New Zealand, Anjum, with Friday prayers in several cities in solidarity with the Muslim community of New Zealand. But then at the same time, overnight, those attacks at Birmingham mosques. What do you make of this issue of Islamophobia, and if these respective societies are dealing with them properly?
I think, we're lucky here in New Zealand in the sense that we haven't had high-level Islamophobia. We haven't had sort of things like acid attacks or major vandalism, those kinds of incidents. What we have here is more low-level discrimination. But even so, our organisation was getting concerned at the rising level of vitriol that we were seeing both online and in real life, which led us to raise concerns with the government. I think that the fact that we're in such a global and interconnected world means that the geographic isolation that we used to have in New Zealand that somewhat protected us from the worst of this is increasingly appearing.
Anjum, one of the things that stood out for me was that a lot of people said in New Zealand that this is not us. And that I know a number of people have pushed back upon, not saying, of course, that the majority of New Zealanders would agree with the attacks that occurred in Christchurch, but to say this is not us, do you think that's a fair statement? Do you think that's sort of, pushing it all under the carpet?
I think it came from the Prime Minister, and it was an aspirational statement, and it was right for the moment. So we have to remember that as those attacks were unfolding, the authorities didn't know how widespread it was. Initially, there were 4 people arrested. The country went into high alert, and the job of the Prime Minister was to dampen down the level of tensions. And I think she did that admirably well. And I think she did what needed to be done in the immediate aftermath of the shootings and in the next few days. What I think needs to happen, though, once the needs of the Christchurch families are met, is that we really need to have a lot more introspection as a country. We need to start talking about what is the reality here. We are a colonised country. We know that our Indigenous peoples suffered from a great deal of violence in the past, and although some redress has happened through the government for that, there are still a lot of major injustices. We know that our Pacifica people that have come here in the past have suffered from the government, and again, that's something that needs to be addressed. And definitely the rising level of Islamophobia is in the mix there that needs to be addressed, and we need to think of a wide-ranging suite of policies that are going to improve everyone's experience of living in this country so that everyone can feel like they belong here, that they've got a future here, that they've got a pathway forward.
Okay. I'm going to put you on the spot just for a moment. Anjum, as a Muslim woman, because that private school in Auckland, which I'm sure you're well aware of, the hijab ban, which it first confirmed and then now has lifted seemingly. What do you make of that entire case? Again, it A, seemed badly timed, and B, it just almost seemed to confirm for many people, at least outside of New Zealand, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, about possible underlying Islamophobia that may exist in some quarters.
Yes, there's this notion that certain groups like to promote, which they call one law for all. But in fact, when you have a law like that, it ends up being inequitable because you're not allowing people the freedom to practice their religious faiths. We know there have been previous cases similar to this where girls have not been allowed to wear hijab. They have taken cases to the Human Rights Commission here, and those cases have been mediated, and the schools have then allowed the girls to wear hijab. So in this particular case of this school, it appears to be one of those high-end schools and more concerned possibly about their reputation and their rules than about fairness, actual equity for all its students.
And then as you can well appreciate, obviously, for many of us sitting outside of New Zealand, we've been looking from the outside in with a lot of concern about the situation. And, we now have this OIC meeting, which has been held with Turkey calling for that. Do you think that there is an appreciation in New Zealand and even amongst the Muslim community in New Zealand that this issue really is very global, that it's touched many people around the world?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I can say so myself in terms of the media work that I've been doing and being interviewed from European, Middle Eastern outlets that indicates that there is a lot of interest. And I think that's quite a good thing. I think it means that people are concerned about what's happening here, and that international spotlight is quite helpful.
Again, put you on the spot just for a moment about his statements. And of course, just a reminder of viewers, he's that senator from Queensland in Australia who made quite a shocking statement after these attacks, essentially pinning the attack back onto Muslims in some ways. That sort of ideology, Anjum, that exists then within certain politicians, and of course these are individuals, and I'm not judging entire societies by that, but the fact that that's allowed to sit in the fashion that it is. What do you make of that?
I think we need to get smarter about how we deal with these kinds of people and about not giving them the oxygen that they need. And I think the media has a responsibility here. You can either relay those messages where they will reach their intended audience, regardless of how you put it out, regardless of how much you criticize it. And this is something that I call the Trump effect, where you saw this happening as well, that a lot of the reporting about his outrageous statements was done in a way to make clear that they were outrageous and unfair. nonetheless, they relayed those statements to people that were sympathetic to them. I think the best way to deal with these kinds of politicians is to simply not report what they're saying and not give them the attention that they're seeking, because they're obviously doing it to get media coverage. They know it works, and it works every single time. If you say something that's outrageous enough, you will get a whole lot of attention.
Okay, we're going to leave it there at that with Ms. Anjum Rahman, social activist and media spokesperson for the Islamic Women's Council of New Zealand, who is speaking to us via Skype there from Hamilton in New Zealand. We're now joined by Mr. Steve Hewitt, who is a senior lecturer at the University of Birmingham, and he's joining us now via Skype from Birmingham in the United Kingdom itself. Steve, we appreciate you taking your time out to speak to us here in Scope. Steve, how did you react when you heard about those 5 mosques being attacked overnight there in Birmingham?
Yeah, so it was 2 nights ago, and the reaction, I'm actually at home right now, and literally about 7, 8 doors down from where I'm sitting right now is actually a mosque right on the street that I live on. Now, thankfully, it wasn't one of the mosques attacked, but it's part of our community, and people put flowers on the mosque because of what happened in New Zealand a week ago today. And so I think the sense, certainly in my community, my part of Birmingham, is absolute shock that this would have occurred, and a sense that, this is part of growing intolerance that you're seeing. Obviously, we saw in New Zealand a week ago, we've seen in the United States, and sadly here in the UK as well.
You know, Steve, it's been growing ever so slowly, hasn't it? This wave of attacks, if I may call it that, against Muslim places of worship. We even had that Quebec mosque shooting not too long ago. Do you think that governments have reacted appropriately, globally, I'm speaking, of course, to this wave?
No, I don't think that they have. I actually wrote a piece about the Quebec attacks. I'm originally Canadian, and I was shocked, not just at the violence that occurred there, but also the sort of lack of response on the part of the government, but on the wider population as well. So I think one positive step that has been seen here in Birmingham is the suggestion that these attacks the other night are going to be treated potentially as terrorism, which is exactly what I think they are. They are efforts to terrorize Muslims living in Birmingham and to send the message that they don't belong here, that they're not welcome. And this is, as you said, is part of a growing wave. And there's this sort of double standard that, if there's an act of violence carried out by someone, claiming to do it in the name of Islam, all Muslims are blamed for it. And then when there's an attack on Muslims, there's this sort of double standard of suggesting that somehow Muslims are to blame when they're the victims directly of violence. Yeah. And I think this climate is just, we saw the attack in New Zealand. You had bombings outside of mosques here several years ago carried out by a Ukrainian student who was in Birmingham. Yeah. And you obviously have had other attacks at Finsbury Park Mosque where a man ran down worshippers outside the mosque. And then you've got this sort of lower level of violence as what occurred here 2 nights ago.
Yeah. I wonder, as an academic yourself, then Steve, how do you assess why we're seeing, even in countries and cities which are very multicultural, that these things are happening? Like we mentioned Canada already, and I'm originally Canadian as well, and it was shocking, obviously, in a country, where I grew up, where it was so multicultural and tolerant, that this sort of an attack would occur there. And people say the same thing about Christchurch, specifically in New Zealand as well, this very multicultural city. Why would something like this occur in a place where you do have minorities seemingly, in contact with the larger population?
Yeah, I mean, I think one point we need to remember is if we think of what happened in New Zealand, if we think about what happened in Quebec City, and it looks like what happened 2 nights ago in Birmingham, that we're probably talking single individuals who've done these horrible things. But the point to remember is they're actually swimming around in a much larger pool of an intellectual climate that sort of fuels that hatred and encourages it. And I think it's a few things. It is anxiety on the part of so-called white populations about growing diversity, about change, about multiculturalism. And that's always been around. There's always been anxiety around immigration and diversity. I think the difference currently is that you've got mainstream politicians, and I have to mention, someone like Donald Trump, who is legitimizing such discourses and such rhetoric in a very public way, either through Twitter or through his speeches or through his policies. And that is, I think, making this far worse, because it's suggesting that there's a legitimacy to some of this discourse and rhetoric. Yeah. Now, most people that hear that aren't going to do anything about it. They just maybe have hate in their hearts or anger. But obviously all it takes is one individual, with access to firearms to do the sort of horrible thing that happened in New Zealand 1 week ago today.
All right, so let's talk about those assault rifles, in fact, and then that gun. As a final question then to you, Steve. We know New Zealand has now spoken about the fact that semi-automatic guns and weapons and other such specific weaponry will be banned, and it's put in, I believe, an April deadline, if I'm not mistaken. What do you make of that? Do you think that's enough of a reaction? What more needs to happen to deal with this? Because it's obviously not just about guns. It's obviously about ideology and et cetera.
No, I think it's a good start. I mean, I'm thankful that I live in the UK, where there are extremely tight gun laws, and it's very difficult for, again, these sorts of people that would be willing to do something like this to get access to firearms here or get access to ammunition. But I think it's a first step. I think there needs to be much more public condemnation, not just of the real far out extremists, but also of more mainstream Islamophobia. I mean, in the British media, it's still quite common. You had a politician here, Boris Johnson, who compared Muslim women wearing niqabs and burqas, compared them to letterboxes, mailboxes, which led to then these women being accosted with people calling them letterboxes. So that kind of mainstream hatred it should not be tolerated and should be called out by people in the media, but it should be called out by politicians as well.
Indeed, Steve. We'll leave that as our final word from you. But of course, sincerely appreciate your time this morning there speaking to us from Birmingham. That was Steve Hewitt, lecturer at the University of Birmingham, who was speaking to us there, sharing his thoughts about what occurred 2 nights ago there in Birmingham, as well as what occurred in New Zealand as well in Christchurch. Now, viewers, just to conclude this segment that we've been talking about, we spoke to, of course, the Deputy Mayor of Christchurch himself, who has given guarantees of some sort that this will not be the last of what we've heard of that attack, that the government there will be dealing with this properly. Then we heard from Ms. Anjum Rahman, of the Islamic Women's Council of New Zealand, and she spoke about, even as a Muslim woman, what, for example, that Auckland private school did by first confirming and then now lifting the hijab ban, and what that signifies specifically in this atmosphere right after a large terrorist attack against Muslims in that country. And then towards the end there, Steve was talking about the double standards and how media, politicians, etc., deal with the Islamophobia that is growing around the world, even in places like Canada and otherwise, in New Zealand as well, which, are proud of themselves about the multiculturalism that they espouse to achieve. We'll keep a close eye, of course, on that Islamophobic movement around the world here in Scope, but stay with us. I'll be back after a short break with our next segment. Thank you for staying with us here in Scope, viewers. Now, the U.S. Secretary of State is in the Middle East for a regional tour. His visit to Israel has paid off for Netanyahu. Donald Trump has tweeted that the U.S. now recognizes the disputed Golan Heights as Israel's, handing the Israeli Prime Minister an unexpected but important card to play ahead of elections. Pompeo is next to visit Lebanon to pressure Prime Minister Hariri to limit Hezbollah and Iranian influence. He's also set to ask the Arab League to hold off on readmitting Syria as a full member. To discuss all of that a bit further, we're joined now by Mr. Joseph Sokhon, who is an international relations expert. He's also a PhD candidate in international relations and is a researcher with a focus partly on geopolitics as well. He's joining us now from Beirut in Lebanon. And we're also joined by Dr. Nicos Panagiotides, who is a Middle East expert. He's also the head of the Geostrategic Observatory of the Middle East and is an assistant professor of international politics at American College. He is joining us now from Nicosia in Cyprus. Thank you both for joining us. Joseph, I wanted to start with you, if I may. The big news, Joseph, of course, is that about the Golan Heights. What are your thoughts about that?
I think Israel has made it clear for everyone that it will not leave it to anyone. And Pompeo, he is now in Israel to help Netanyahu in his elections and also to help him get the legitimacy that he needs right now to maintain the status quo in the area, because we all know that how much Netanyahu is following the American agenda in the Middle East.
Yeah. Okay. And Nick, what do you make of that? What do you make of the decision about the occupied Golan Heights? What message is Trump sending, A, to the Palestinians, and B, is this just to support Netanyahu politically?
First of all, dear, thank you for the invitation. Waqar. Sorry if I don't pronounce your name as
that's correct.
should. Yeah. And I will answer straightforward your question. I think it's an American move in order to boost the electoral campaign of Netanyahu. But at the end of the day, I think it will be counterproductive because it will undermine American plans to promote their own plan, the so-called the plan of the century. What message it will give to the international community if the U.S. administration reverse all the precedents and recognize an occupied Arab land? There are various United Nations resolutions, United Nations of the Security Council resolutions that say that we are talking about occupied land. If American administration recognize this the illegal annexation, and it accepts Israeli sovereignty over Arab land, over occupied Syria barren land, it will provoke the Arab sentiment in general that it needed in order to support its plan for Middle East peace, for peace between Palestinians and Israelis. I can say more if you want, but if you want to ask me something more on it.
Sure. No, I wanted to go to Joseph with that. In fact, Joseph, as Nick there pointed out, what do you think this does then for any chances of peace with Palestinians?
I think it's very clear since Trump has made his a great deal for the Middle East, has made it clear that he wants Israel to be in peace. He's not gonna accept to any smaller state of Israel. So he will provide any support for Israel to expand, or at least to keep its boundaries as they are right now. But I think also the Americans are very well aware of the situation in the Middle East, and they are ready to bargain maybe to get everyone on the table so they can get a deal where Israel security is guaranteed, and also the energy supplies that the Americans are planning to implement from Israel to the EU market to be secure. It's very different. We are in a very different era right now. The gas supplies are the most important for gas supplies is security. You cannot have gas lines in the water or on land if you don't have a peaceful state, and to be able to reach every market in the world and to supply every market, especially the European market with gas. You have to from Israel. You have to have a very secure state in the Middle East, and this is what lack right now.
Yeah. So, Nick, obviously the Arab League has reacted, the EU has reacted, and Turkey's president as well has reacted as well, saying that this will bring the region to the new edge of a crisis. The Arab League says that the Golan Heights, it confirmed that this is occupied Syrian territory. Do you think that any of these bodies will be able to pressure the U.S. to rethink its decision?
Some pressure can be exerted, can be a kind of some pressure, yes, but we are talking, the Arab League is weak. International relations are governed by great powers. Great powers set the lines in which within other weaker states and entities and international institutions act. So I think in the era of Donald Trump, things are very difficult. This is my point of view, and I have to make it clear. One must recall Trump's decision to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital. Also, an illegal decision that reverses the status quo and the precedent on this thing. I'm just asking on this. If we want to bring in our attention geopolitics and how this might help the energy security of the region and this, it's another issue. I can comment on this. I disagree, but if someone wants to exterminate the weak party in the equation, the Palestinians, he can do it. But you're asking me about which are my opinions on this, and I am telling you straightforward.
Yes, no, and we appreciate that, Nick. Joseph, we know that one of the biggest supporters of Palestinians in this region, it can be argued at least, are Hezbollah and Iran. So I wanted to shift now towards Lebanon itself, and we know that Mike Pompeo, I believe, may have already arrived in Lebanon or will be arriving in Lebanon today, and he is going to be pressuring Prime Minister Hariri to try to limit the influence of Hezbollah and Iran. What do you make of that, Joseph?
Actually, everyone here in Lebanon, if you look at the media right now, everyone is talking about how Pompeo is going to pressure Hariri and to decrease or to try to decrease the influence of Hezbollah in Lebanon and across the Middle East by linking every action that Hezbollah will make in the future to Lebanon as a whole state. He will not separate anymore Israel from the Lebanese state, and this is a huge move. But this is not actually what he's going. I think he's not going only to tackle this issue, but rather he will go further and to discuss the new energy map for the Middle East. And that Israel is trying to lobby for in the United States, which is to distribute gas or to implement a gas line from the territorial waters towards Cyprus and then reaching EU markets. I think Pompeo, he will use the sanctions against Hezbollah, and he will use everything that the United States has, including military aids and everything related to what Americans have to leverage or to get an agreement with the Lebanese state about the solution, to find a suitable solution for Israel and for Lebanon to get this gas line through the water, even if it passes the exclusive economic zone of Lebanon.
That's very interesting, Joseph, because I want to, in fact, Joseph, get then a reaction from Nick. Nick, let's discuss then this gas line, as Joseph there mentioned. Do you agree that America must be concerned about the gas line and, of course, Israel's energy needs?
I will say this, yes, actually, I think that Pompeo will mediate when he will visit Lebanon. He tried to solve the difference between Israel and Lebanon regarding their maritime and regarding that exclusive economic zones. Yes, there are many problems. There is one problem, one legal and political issue with this, that it must be solved, because Lebanon must be brought to the whole discussion about energy. As you know, in Cyprus, there are American firms, ExxonMobil, that are acting. There are some ambitious plans to create a Middle East pipeline, the East Med, as it is called, not a Middle East pipeline, but a pipeline that will commence from Israel. It will come to Cyprus and will go to Greece, and afterwards towards Balkans and Italy. So stability is the asked thing and is the desired thing in this situation. But as we know, Lebanon and Israel are in a state of war. They don't have a peace agreement. Okay, the confessional system of Lebanon is very complex. Joseph knows quite well since he lives here. But, you know, there are many components that comprise the political system of Lebanon. Shia, Sunni, Hezbollah, many parties.
Yes.
We know about the hegemonic position of Hezbollah in the political system of Lebanon. It has 3 ministers. I think it commands a majority in the parliament. It has its own military forces. It is involved in the Syrian civil war. There is a geostrategic scene there that it's very complex. So the Americans will press in order to, if they can, to solve this problem and go ahead with their plans, because they are contributing. They are also a part of the energy equation in the basin of Levant, in the Levant basin.
Right. So, Joseph, I'll give you the final word then, Joseph, because many people, as Nick there said, Joseph, do not understand Lebanon's political system very clearly. It is complex. But just put this into context for us, Joseph, how important Hezbollah is within Lebanon as a political party, as a political force. Do you think that it will spoil any chances for Pompeo and Israel to be able to get any sort of a gas line then?
I think Israel, United States of America, they know very well the complexity of Lebanon. But and this what they make. This what made Pompeo came here to Lebanon with sanctions, with military aid, with some. I think he's gonna pressure Lebanon. He's not going to ask them if they're gonna accept his deal. He's gonna pressure, and he knows very well how much Hezbollah can spoil this deal. But with the sanctions and with Hezbollah saying last week that he needs his support. He needs the Shia support. He needs money from Shiite communities so he can maintain his position. I think it's not gonna be easy for him to spoil it, to spoil any deal. Maybe they will try to see how much they can benefit from this deal. Also, I would like to draw your attention to a fact that. Even if Lebanon didn't accept the deal, and he said that he will not accept also the military aid from the United States of America, this will be a huge cost for Lebanon, because every military system in Lebanon, the military system in Lebanon is American. They cannot be provided from any other aid, foreign aid. For example, the Russian military aid will not be adaptable to the military system in Lebanon, because it's basically everything is American here, and this is a big pressure for Lebanon and for every component here to accept the deal or to see where they can benefit from it.
Very well. We'll leave there as our final word. Joseph, of course, appreciate both of your times and insights. That was Joseph Sokhon, international relations expert, I should say. He's also a PhD candidate in international relations and is a researcher with focus partly on geopolitics. He was speaking to us from Beirut in Lebanon. And we were also joined by Dr. Nicos Panagiotides, who is a Middle East expert. He was speaking to us from Nicosia in Cyprus. He's also the head of the Geostrategic Observatory of the Middle East and is also assistant professor of international politics at American College. Now, viewers, as both of our guests spoke about, there are complexities to this trip of Mike Pompeo. Joseph there brought up a possible link to a gas line, which the Americans would want for Israel to be able to secure its energy needs, and that may very well be playing out behind the scenes in all of this. But the Golan Heights decision seems to be one that is political, meant to support Netanyahu going into these elections in about a month's time there in Israel. As far as limiting Hezbollah and its influence within Lebanon, that we'll have to wait and see if these sanctions that are being spoken about will actually limit Hezbollah influence. We'll keep a close eye on that, though, here in Scope. But I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.